Tony, kind of into the nuts and bolts of business valuation. Give us a little background on kind of the different ways to go about valuing a business.
Yeah, I was talking with a few folks before we started. There's a lot of different ways that I guess I see businesses being valued. Mike kind of touched on multiples, and sometimes people talk about, monthly sales multiples or an EBITDA multiple or these kinds of things. And I think sometimes those are right, sometimes they're fine. But to Mike's point, it can get you in a lot of trouble. I can bring up horror stories. One of my clients currently, they bought a business about 5 years ago, and the way they valued it was they paid for the assets, and then they came up with a number of what goodwill should be. And the best I can come up with is the sellers wanted to divide goodwill divided by two, and this is what they need to retire. So that's what they sold the business for. Our clients, the buyers, now 5 years later, are in a situation where they funded that transaction with some notes, some debt, and they're in trouble. I mean, they can't pay for it, and so the company was grossly overvalued. My advice would be to not do that. Really, what when you bring in someone to do valuation, there's really three different approaches that they're going to do. Two are most common, and really there's, we call it an income approach, which is, these are what I'll call the intrinsic value of the business. What are the cash flows that the business generates? And I think, to kind of build on Mike's point, when you're in a transaction and buyers or sellers, I think there can be that's where a lot of the negotiation comes in, or understanding what the assumptions are about those future cash flows. And if both sides of the transaction, can kind of push back and understand the assumptions there, that will help the process. But so there's an income approach, and then we do look at market multiples. So we'll look at the public companies that are comparable. We'll look at transactions, and we'll look at sales multiples. We'll look at EBITDA multiples, and depending on the nature of the business, that can depend. But I would argue that's really kind of we use it to triangulate the value from an income approach. So, people making decisions strictly based on multiples, I think, again, sometimes those are fine. Sometimes that can get you in a lot of trouble. In my mind, a multiple is really just the output of the cash flows the business generates. So you may be higher, you may be lower, but these are the things that when you're thinking about evaluation, or when someone's going through and doing evaluation, those multiples are really used to triangulate value. The third approach is, we call it an asset approach, and basically what happens in these situations, Mike brought up an example of bankruptcy. If there's a distressed situation, sometimes a business is worth more dead than alive. So you go through, you do projections, you try to come up with cash flows, and you basically go through the balance sheet and value the assets and the liabilities, and what you're left with is more value than you'd have to continue to operate the business. So that can be kind of often a floor valuation for people in certain situations. But for the typical situation that we see, there is usually an income approach and a market approach, where multiples are used to help you assess the reasonableness of your projections and your cash flows.